Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Goldberg, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Van Dijk, Mr. Noten, and Mr. Hagoort. The John Adams Institute is pleased to have you, Mrs. Goldberg, as a keynote speaker at the Institute tonight. Thank you for coming. And I would like to compliment you with the Dutch translation of your book, Uw Koninkrijk Komen, published by Den Haag Uitgevers. And the copy is on sale, of course, tonight here in the back of this room. Mr. Goldberg's book intrigued me as it touches so many of the undercurrent anxieties present in Dutch society. The anxiety for a bigger influence of religion and religious organizations on politics, education, and on the legal system. And I thought it would be very interesting for our audience to learn more about this topic by comparing the situation between the United States and the Netherlands. How organized are Dutch religious organizations? Do they have a big influence on Dutch politics? Mrs. Goldberg argues in her book that it's an organizational and a numbers game, what's happening in the United States, the way the religious right gained so much power in the Republican Party and elsewhere in the United States. It's interesting to discuss whether this could happen in Holland and in a broader perspective in Europe. I'm sure we will discuss this aspect, and our panelists will have a good answer on that question. After the keynote speech of Mrs. Goldberg, we will have our debate on the influence of religion on Dutch politics and the educational system. And I'm very proud that we have here tonight Mr. Van Dijk, member of the Dutch Parliament for the Christian Democrats, Mr. Noten, member of the Senate for the Dutch Labour Party, and Mr. Hagoort, director of the Evangelical Broadcasting Organization, the AO, in the Netherlands. Thank you for coming tonight and being a panelist. Our moderator for tonight is James Kennedy. He's a professor of contemporary history of the Free University, and he will introduce Mrs. Goldberg, and you have the floor. Where are you? Over there.
Thank you, Corinne. The religious right, writes the American historian James Patterson in his recent book of America called Restless Giant, has become the strongest grassroots community-based movement of late 20th century life in the United States. Indeed, their powerful presence has been noted in the last 25 years, if not longer. And in recent years, too, their political power has generated a cascade of books on their power, and also many of them alerting us to their dangers, including the book Kingdom Coming, Uw Koninkrijk Komen by Michelle Goldberg, which has just had the good fortune of being translated into Dutch. It's hard to get a handle on what the religious right is, how to generate, how to essentially define its strength, how big is it, how influential is it, how well organized is it, who is the religious right. And I think that this problem is also signaled by the problems that James Patterson, the historian, himself signals. The first is that what we call the religious right is, in fact, in many cases, a very divided set of groups. People with very, very different theological viewpoints, often opposed to each other, often also with different political traditions. They also have different ways of mobilizing. They also have different sources of political and religious inspiration. There is, in fact, a small part of the religious right that finds its influence stemming from the Netherlands and the thought of Abraham Kuyper in particular. Michelle Goldberg refers to the importance that some religious right assign to a Christian worldview. And the very concept of a Christian worldview finds part of its origins in this early 20th century Christian democratic or confessional Orthodox Protestant politician. The second point that Patterson makes about the difficulty in defining and discerning the strength of the religious right has to do with the fact that American culture in some respects has been moving over the last decades further away from them, that their ability to control or direct American society has diminished over time rather than increased. Perhaps one could also argue that the religious right has risen precisely at a time when American fundamentalism is losing much of its religious distinctiveness. That as conservative Christians become more politically engaged, they become less theologically engaged. One of the interesting things about surveys of American conservative Protestants is that they, in fact, do not know their Bible except their favorite texts that they wish to wave in everybody's face. So there are all these signs that the religious right is vociferous, divided, maybe not, in fact, at the threshold of victory. And yet, this may, I think, is little comfort to those who, in fact, see what the religious right is doing in the United States and some of the effects it is having on politics. In the first place, Patterson's book, written about the United States, takes us to 2000. And what happens after 2000, after 6.5 years of the Bush administration? In some respects, the Bush administration has been a failure, which has also not meant good things for the religious right in the United States. In other respects, the Bush administration has not always been as supportive of the religious right as some of its members have thought it ought to be. Nevertheless, the religious right has had access to political power in unprecedented ways as a result of George Bush being President of the United States. And Michelle Goldberg gives us some important analysis of what that has meant in concrete terms. Furthermore, the point is not really about how many millions and millions of Americans belong to conservative churches or even members of organizations that support the religious right, like the Republican Party. The point is, how well are the most dedicated of them, those called Christian nationalists by Michelle Goldberg, how well mobilized they are, how well organized they are, and what kinds of influence they can bring to bear on American politics and on larger numbers of perhaps more moderately minded fellow travelers. And I think that's also an important point that she raises in her book. And the last consideration is that we might argue that it is precisely the deterioration of the cultural stance, the cultural position of conservative Christians that leads in part to the kind of aggressiveness that you often see among them. They are, in some sense, very, very powerful politically, not because they are winning the game, you could argue, but perhaps because they are losing it, that they feel the anxiety of something slipping away. And I think you can also sense some of that in Michelle Goldberg's book. How these organizations that are associated with Christian nationalism have organized themselves and with which main causes and aims they have in mind, that is something that I leave to our honored guest for this evening, Michelle Goldberg, to further work out in this, and as she explicates, as she draws from her impassioned and compelling book on the rise of Christian nationalism in the United States. In particular, her own encounter, and this is something that I think was a very, very important strength of the book, her encounter with a number of individual Christian nationalists sheds important light on what motivates individuals in the United States to become engaged in what we can call, and what Michelle Goldberg calls, Christian nationalism. So without further ado, I'm going to give the word to Michelle. The program for the night consists of 3 different parts. The first is a keynote address by Michelle herself. The second is a panel discussion that tries to work out any analogies, parallels, and also differences between what is going on in the United States and what is going on in the Netherlands. And the third part of this, and this is not an unimportant part, is the discussion. Discussion is being furthered by the audience, and we hope that you can participate in asking questions of either Michelle Goldberg or of the panel members. But with as I said, without any further ado, I will now give the word to Michelle. She's a journalist who worked at Salon, but is now decided to work full-time on a second book, which she may also tell us more about.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. There was a Jim Carrey movie that came out in the late 1990s called The Truman Show, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with it or if it came out in the Netherlands, but it was about a guy who was brought up inside of a reality television show, and so he lived in an entirely imaginary world that was so consistent and so seamless that he had no way to know that his entire reality was a fraud. It was a totally closed system. And that's, in many ways, how I think of the American religious right. It has created a parallel universe. Its ideologues work in many ways like the producers of The Truman Show. And it would like all Americans to live inside the alternative reality that it's creating. The idea of a parallel reality, I think, is very important to understanding what's happened in American politics in the last 7 or so years in ways that actually go beyond the religious right. Whether it's, widespread denial about global warming, whether it's the belief, very common until recently, that Saddam Hussein was behind September 11th. The subversion of truth has been a key factor of American politics and of Republican rule. There was this really famous quote that some of you might have heard by a Bush aide in a story by Ron Suskind that came out in the New York Times a couple of years ago. And the aide was kind of sneering at Ron Suskind, and he said, that guys like him, journalists, are part of what we call the reality-based community. And he defined this reality-based community, which he meant as an insult, as people who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. And then Ron Suskind writes, I nodded and murmured something about Enlightenment principles and empiricism. He cut me off. That's not the way the world really works anymore, he continued. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, judiciously, as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too, and that's how things will sort out. We're history's actors, and all of you will be left to study what we do. So the right has created a climate in the United States where the popular understanding of reality is subject to political pressure, and this context is crucial for understanding how the religious right, the movement that I call Christian nationalism, has been able to operate. I quote Hannah Arendt often in my book, and it's not because I'm trying to argue that the United States is on the verge of totalitarianism. I've traveled to many genuinely fascist countries. The United States is still, thankfully, rather far away from that. But the techniques that she described in The Origins of Totalitarianism have a lot to teach us about the way the right is operating. And one of the things she writes is that before mass leaders seize the power to fit reality to their lies, their propaganda is marked by its extreme contempt for facts as such. For in their opinion, fact depends entirely on the man who can fabricate it. So when I wrote my book, and to write my book, I'm a journalist, I'm not a historian and not a political scientist, and so to write my book, I kind of just plunged myself into this alternative reality. I went to far more right-wing churches than most Jewish girls from Brooklyn ever will. I went to, creationist seminars. I followed around a one-ton monument of the Ten Commandments that had become a kind of object of almost religious veneration by members of this movement. I went to, rallies of kind of neo-Confederates and white supremacists, and then I went to right-wing conferences in Washington where I saw many of the same characters. And what I tried to do was get a feel for how this movement was functioning on the ground, in places like Texas and Colorado and Ohio, especially in the run-up to the 2004 election, and then how this grassroots movement had been able to translate that into real political power. And so before I go further, I want to quickly define what I mean by Christian nationalism. It's a phrase that I use intentionally to try to differentiate the movement that I'm reporting on from evangelical Christianity as a whole. Somewhere between 30 and 40% of Americans identify as evangelicals. And the vast majority of Americans identify as Christians. America's a big exception in the Western world in still being an incredibly religious country. Most people still don't believe in evolution. Majorities tell pollsters that they believe that the world is going to end in a apocalyptic battle at the biblical site of Megiddo or Armageddon in Israel. And yet, thankfully, not all of these people, by any means, are part of this movement that I call Christian nationalists, although they can sometimes be swayed by claims that their faith is under attack, that liberals are planning to ban the Bible and institute homosexual propaganda in the schools, which is a kind of frequent demagogic litany in American politics. The movement that I'm talking about is smaller. It's somewhere between probably 10 and 15% of the population if you look at different surveys. That's still a lot of people in a country of nearly 300 million. And this is a group, it's really a political philosophy that they have in many ways more than a theology. Christian nationalism holds that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, that the founders never intended to separate church and state, and that church-state separation and secular society is a fraud that's been perpetrated by devious leftists and secularists in the last 100 years. And so to kind of undo that so that America can reclaim the glory that they believe that it's lost, they believe that it's necessary to kind of Christianize all of the institutions of American life. And I'll talk a little bit about what that's meant in practice. It also posits a homosexual conspiracy to undermine America. And I think it's important to understand that this is something different than just being against gay marriage. This idea that there is a kind of vast and insidious and powerful lobby working to penetrate all of the institutions of American life. This kind of rhetoric is, of course, familiar in Europe, from the time before World War II, and it kind of works in similar ways. There's a lot of similarities between the way that the Nazis talked about Jewish people and the way that this movement talks about gay people. And one reason I think that that's important for people in Europe to understand is because a lot of this rhetoric is migrating to Eastern Europe, and it's become very, very common, for example, in Poland. The movement also blames liberals and secularists for making America vulnerable to, for weakening America and rendering it somewhat effeminate so that it could be victimized on September 11th. And that's part of the reason that September 11th has sparked this resurgence and kind of outpouring of kind of jingoistic, spiritually tinged nationalism that's just now starting to recede a bit. So because this movement sees all of American institutions as being kind of deformed by secularism, they've set out to create their own parallel institutions. So if you read real history books, they'll tell you about, that while there were certainly some devout founders of the United States, there was, a huge role played by Enlightenment ideas, and certainly a commitment to separating church and state, for really the first time in human history. And so, Thomas Jefferson said, "History, I believe, furnishes no example of a priest-ridden people maintaining a free civil government. This marks the lowest grade of ignorance of which their civil as well as religious leaders will always avail themselves for their own purposes." So this is a very inconvenient truth for the Christian right, and so it's set about to rewrite it. And there is whole libraries full of revisionist histories of the United States, which will claim that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. They will usually downplay the role of Jefferson and Madison and seek to elevate the role of the most religious founders. They will, cherry pick quotations. And this kind of revisionist history is increasingly making its way into mainstream discourse in all kinds of different ways. They will say that these kind of Edenic principles of this lost America have been undermined by Karl Marx and Charles Darwin, and that has that's part of, although certainly not all of the impetus for this attack on evolution that's been this really kind of sustained fact of American life for the last couple of decades. So similarly, scientists, there is no debate about the theory of evolution among legitimate scientists, and so this movement has created alternative quasi-scientific organizations that purport to purport to be conducting scientific studies discrediting evolution. And if you listen and you go to events where people from this movement are speaking only to supporters, they'll often talk about their theological motivations. But in public, they make it seem as if there is a legitimate scientific debate. And it's actually going, in many cases, farther than just debate or textbooks or words. There's a museum opening actually this month outside of Cincinnati, a kind of massive state-of-the-art creation museum, which looks just like the museums that I used to go on field trips to. Maybe not just like, it's not quite the Smithsonian, but it's very impressive. You walk in, there is a kind of fantastically professional diorama of an animatronic dinosaur in a rainforest setting with a small child, as dinosaurs and children coexisted together 6,000 years ago in the Garden of Eden. There's a planetarium, again, a full-scale professional planetarium where you can lie back and watch a show about the stars and how their light has traveled 6,000 years to reach the Earth, because 6,000 years is the age of the universe. And when you are embedded in a reality like this, I think it's very difficult to see your way out. You kind of do tend to assume that what you are taught from infancy, what you learn in your schools from your parents, what you see in museums, has at least some relation to the actual physical world. Again, mainstream scientists have concluded that homosexuality is not a disease. It is certainly not curable, but this movement has created a vast network of rehab centers and counseling centers that will try to turn gay people straight and do kind of immense psychological damage in the process. They've created a vast network of something called crisis pregnancy centers, which mimic women's health centers. They frequently have they have volunteers wearing white coats to simulate doctors, and will tell the women who happen upon them that they will warn them against the dangers of contraception, and if these women happen to be pregnant, will tell them that abortion causes breast cancer, infertility, and vastly increased risks of suicide. So again, we can look at Hannah Arendt, who has described how these kind of movements build an entire parallel reality, parallel institutions, and the quote, if I'm not mangling it, is that a movement like this will duplicate every feature of the non-totalitarian world in the form of humbug. The reason that this matters to people beyond those who are being kind of raised within this movement is that what we've seen in the last few years are these institutions slowly replacing the institutions of kind of the mainstream institutions of American life. So that when Bush has wanted to recruit people to work in the Department of Health and Human Services, he will recruit them from crisis pregnancy centers as opposed to from the kind of legitimate medical infrastructure of the United States. He has filled the bureaucracy with people who insist on treating evolution as a theory. And in one famous case, a scientist at NASA was reprimanded by a political appointee for referring to the Big Bang with that as though it were an accepted scientific explanation as opposed to just a kind of devious secular theory. You've seen this in the Justice Department. You've seen both in the Civil Rights Division, which has been charged with protecting civil rights, has largely stopped bringing cases against discrimination against African Americans or other minorities, and has now devoted itself to rectifying the war on Christianity, which is part of this movement's propaganda, and has gone about pursuing cases where Christians were alleged to be the victim of discrimination. I did a talk in New York with somebody from the Anti-Defamation League, the civil rights director there, and she's to the right of me on many things, but we deal with similar issues in terms of separation of church and state. And she was talking about how one factor of American life that she deals with is an increasing proselytization in the workplace. There's a kind of aggressive evangelical culture in the United States that you see in public schools and in jobs, which is actually not illegal and should be protected. People do have the right of free speech and free association. But the culture is nonetheless, this cultural change is nonetheless troubling for some people, where you'll see people organizing into evangelical Bible studies, prayer groups, and to refuse to participate, although not necessarily punished, certainly marks you as an outsider. And after this talk was over, a woman came up to me and said, my daughter works in a place like that. And I said, that's terrible. And where does she work? And she said, the Justice Department. That's true. And so, in certain ways, Holland, from where I sit, across the Atlantic, seems to be exempt from much of this. Holland, like the rest of Europe, has, kind of embraced the ideals of the Enlightenment, has, rationality still seems to be a very important operating principle of public policy and government decisions. But nonetheless, I think that some of this is going to start impacting Europe in ways that transcend foreign policy. And there are obviously important implications of this for foreign policy, not just in terms of American policy in the Middle East, which is heavily informed by ideas about the end times and the rapture and the duty to aid and return the Jews to biblical Israel. Not that that motivates everything the administration does, but it is heavily informed by that. But you also see things like the defunding of family planning programs, the promotion of dubious abstinence-only education policies throughout Africa that have had a fairly devastating effect, and now increasingly the promotion and the kind of exporting of, say, the ex-gay movement, the crisis pregnancy centers, the rhetoric of the anti-abortion movement, intelligent design, to Europe, especially Eastern Europe. And I should say before I go any further that I am somewhat agnostic about where our dear leader actually stands on these issues. There's some question about where he falls on what I sometimes have called the cynicism, fanaticism continuum. He is, on the one hand, clearly believes that he has a direct hotline to God, that he has been chosen and given some kind of special messianic mission. On the other hand, there's quite a lot of cynicism in the way this movement is used. The movement, again, is not the entire Republican Party, but it is the most organized faction in American politics. And so while it can't guarantee elections, it's decisive in close ones. So how much of this has been how much we are being run, again, by fanatics, and how much we're being run by what one Bush aide once called, or one disaffected Bush aide once called Mayberry Machiavellis, is still somewhat in dispute. However, we've seen over and over again that one of the ways that the administration likes to reward people in this movement is in foreign postings and in places like the United Nations, where a lot of Americans don't pay much attention. So you've seen over and over again some of the most radical members of this movement being put on American delegations to important United Nations conferences. I remember seeing, and I write in my book actually ends with this rather remarkable scene at the UN where a woman who had been put on the delegation gave a slideshow comparing abortion to the Holocaust and Betty Friedan to Joseph Stalin. And this was a kind of astonishing thing to have, a representative of the United States be doing. And this kind of thing is happening more and more. So I just came back, I was in Poland a couple of days ago, and as some of you probably know, gay marriage and abortion have become hugely central issues in Poland in a way that really recalls the United States. There's a huge amount of demagoguery about the homosexual agenda. And in many cases, anxiety about gay people and about gay conspiracies has been conflated into anxiety about Europe, so that you often see them talking about being, having kind of homosexual indoctrination imposed on them by bureaucrats in Brussels, and having, often the kind of horror image that they conjure up is of the Berlin Love Parade invading the streets of Warsaw. So I was at this conference, the World Congress of Families, and it was a couple of thousand people in the Palace of Science and Culture in the center of Warsaw. And the people who were attending were certainly serious people in Polish politics. The president was supposed to give the keynote speech, but he ended up not being able to come, so he wrote a speech and had somebody else deliver it. But you had, the leader, you had the education minister, the the leader of the Polish parliament, of several other members of the Polish parliament, a very high-level representative of the Vatican, the undersecretary at the State Department for Population from the United States, Ellen Sauerbrey, as well as people from Venezuela, Kenya, Japan, Korea, or South Korea, Belgium, Spain, Mexico, France, Canada, many other countries in Europe. And a lot of what they were talking about was how they can kind of sabotage, or if not, they didn't speak about it in terms of sabotage, how they can save the European Union, how they can prevent any kind of liberal social guarantees from being written into any future European Union constitution, how they can fight the edicts of the European Court of Human Rights. And so you had, and this has become a real issue because Poland is part of the European Union. The European Union has made certain guarantees. It does guarantee freedom from discrimination, or at least, this treaty does guarantee equality. And so there's a real question because you have gay rights activists in Poland imploring the EU and imploring the European Commission to intervene. And in some sense, in some ways they've issued statements, not that statements are worth all that much, they at least give people a sense of solidarity. They've issued statements about the homophobia, the rampant homophobia among the government of Poland, and this again has resulted in a whole new level of kind of nationalist outrage and questions about sovereignty. So now it's Poland, but these forces are also active in Slovakia, in Hungary, in Italy, as we can see from this kind of massive march. And it's something that I very much hope that the countries of Western Europe are able to contend with, in part because throughout these last few grim and terrible years in the United States, the European Union has been a source of hope to some of us, has been, it seemed like a kind of oasis of the values that we've often clung to. If that oasis is to be threatened by the same forces that have changed America in really substantial ways, then we will all really need God's help. So thank you very much.
Corien Krijgsman has, thank you very much for your address and given a lot to think about. I'm going to ask the panel just a couple minutes to see if they'd like to react to what you had to say. For those of you who don't know specifically who's who here, I will do that just for a moment. To my immediate right is Henk Hagoort, who is director of the AO, the Evangelical Broadcasting Association. To his right is Jan Jacob van Dijk, who is a member of Dutch Parliament for the Christian Democratic Appeal and is also professor of Christian social thought at the Free University. And furthest to my right is Senator Noten of the Labour Party, who is also the leader of that party in the first chamber of the Dutch Parliament. I was wondering if any of you, I know you're not versed in the American situation in particular, whether you'd have any reaction to what Michelle Goldberg has written. Most of you have received an advance copy, not all of you, and also what she presented to tonight. Maybe I'll just begin immediately on my right.
Yeah, thank you. What strikes me is in the book is that one of the things you discover among the Christian right is a thing you do yourself in the book very often. That's a kind of how do you say it in English, democracy? But there are some arguments in the book that are the same as the accusations you have to the Christian rights. I mean that you see a kind of conspiracy and a threat. And I think basically what we see is politics is about ideologies. Politics is about having influence. And I think the task of politics and politicians is to regulate it and to divide some way of power. But seeing people striving for influence is not the same as discovering a threat. I think there are all kinds of relationships between people you discover in Christian American, and there will be that kind of relationships and acquaintances in the Christian among Christians in the Netherlands. But that doesn't mean that they share a hidden agenda or have a strive for power. So I think you're just going one step too far in your conclusions, and I think that's not necessary.
Okay. We're going to give you a chance to respond in just a minute. Jan Jacob van Dijk?
Yes. First, I would like to congratulate you with the Dutch translation and also with your book. I've read it when I was in France for a short holiday, and it indicates how pleasant it is to read this book. It is very quickly written, and you can read it very quickly, and well, it is a pleasure to read it. But I do not agree with everything which is in the book. Not due to the fact that I'm very familiar with the situation in the United States. You are far more familiar, and you know far more about it than I do. But I agree more or less with what Mr. Henk Hagoort has stated. After 135 pages, I got the impression that there was a kind of conspiracy theory behind it. And I do not agree with Christian nationalism as you have described it. But sometimes I got the impression that you are building a theory based on some incidents. And that is one of the questions I would like to put on the table. Is it, for example, what you have put forward, that people are stating that the Earth and the universe is only 6,000 years old? Is that a common aspect within the Christian nationalism? All millions who are following that kind of system, that kind of ideology, do believe it. That's my first. My second one, that's more about your social welfare. What you are describing is that the Bush administration has introduced the system of vouchers. Vouchers so that some people who need, for example, some medication or some treatment for their addiction to drugs, they can receive a voucher. And with that voucher, they can go to what kind of organization they would like to go to have the treatment. What is wrong with that kind of system? It is a very good system. But you are putting it in a kind of conspiracy theory in the way that it will only strengthen the Christian organizations. And that I don't believe. So those are some remarks I would like to make, and I will keep it short. Okay.
On Noten?
I haven't read the book, but I've read pieces that have been written about the book, so please. But it gave me the same idea when I listened to you. I do not really recognize very much about what you're saying to the Dutch situation. And that worries me a little bit, because maybe I'm blinded by the light. Maybe a lot of things are happening, but I'm not aware of the parallel system, and maybe it exists also here. I do not really think so. Because what you are describing, I do believe that's what is happening, but that doesn't mean that I do understand what the meaning of it is. Where does it come from? What do we see? And I do believe, although I'm an optimistic man, I do believe that the impact of the Enlightenment in America, but also in Europe, is very exaggerated. I do not really believe that we are children of the Enlightenment. It's skin deep. I think we are children of the Reformatie.
The Reformation.
The Reformation. I do think that the impact of the Inquisition is much bigger than the of Quasimodo Aude and Erasmus. So, getting towards the Enlightenment is a struggle for society. I do really think that, for example, democracy as a system is very, very young in evolutionary terms. It's bizarre the way we think that it's normal, that it's day-to-day life. It's about 50 years here that it is quite stable, maybe 150, but that's what we're talking about. In terms of history, that's yesterday. So I think that what you are describing is very normal, it has always been so. There is there are many people in this country, just the way it is in America, I think, who do need the security of national conservatism. It has always been so. And maybe religion is a way to give it a place, but I do not think that religion itself is the source of what we are seeing. I think it's projection of something what is underneath it. A friend of mine said that 15% of all Dutch people are xenophobes and do hate homos. That has been always. It used to be 16%, he said, so we are going in the right direction.
15 and 16.
It used to be 16
yeah.
and now it's 15, he says. I don't know what his source is, but as a way of thinking about life, I do like it.
You've made a sort of a queue of responses. Would you like
Sure.
to say something
First I'd
back?
like to respond to the idea that this is a conspiracy theory, which what I think I'm describing is a political movement. So the only sense in which it's a conspiracy theory is the sense in which all politics is a conspiracy. It's people within an ideology meeting and planning to change society. The thing that I think I need to emphasize is that I'm not saying that the means are illegitimate or occult. What I try to describe in this book is really a triumph of organizing. Organizing first at the smallest level in, caucuses, town councils, school boards, on and on, so that now it's again, the one kind of bright spot for the left is that this is testament to the power of political mobilization. But because the means are not kind of secret, not conspiratorial, that doesn't mean that the ends are nothing to be feared and that the ends are not threatening, and certainly not threatening to my vision of what the United States could and should and has been in the past. There's been substantial changes in the United States, tremendously negative in my opinion. And speaking to the point about vouchers, this is, I think, one of the examples. The vouchers themselves, there's some debate about vouchers and what they do to other kinds of public services, but I don't want to get into that now. I don't have a problem per se with vouchers or with religiously run social services, which are quite old in the United States. We've had religious social services that get government money, the Salvation Army, Catholic Charities, Lutheran Family and Children's Services. This isn't new. What is new is that these services, like the one that you mentioned that I write about, Set Free Indeed, this drug treatment facility, can make proselytization and conversion to Christianity the key aim of their program and still get government funding. In a country, this is a new thing in the United States, or if not new, it's new in modern history. It's been quite a while since we had kind of this idea of sin and redemption being explicitly at the heart of our public policy. The other new thing is the ability to discriminate with public money. And so one of the stories that I tell in this book is about what happened at the Salvation Army. Again, the Salvation Army, like other organizations, has been able to get public money for a long time, and it's just that they used to have to abide by different regulations. They used to have to set up a kind of separate institution to do their political work or to do their social work that was separate from their religious mission. And so Bush, by kind of loosening those regulations, has allowed groups like the Salvation Army to refuse to hire non-believers and to kind of discriminate on religious grounds, even when they're doing totally publicly funded public functions, so that the Salvation Army gets about $50 million to run drug treatment, foster care, adoption, group homes, things like that in New York. And one of the things that they did after Bush kind of changed the regulation is set out to Christianize the agency. They sent in somebody to go around finding out who the homosexuals were, who the non-Christians were, and then they made their life intolerable until they eventually left. And there's now a lawsuit pending. And the interesting thing about the lawsuit is that the Justice Department, which of course is taking the side of the Salvation Army, isn't substantially disputing the facts of the case. They're just saying that the administration has a right to do this, or that the Salvation Army has a right to do this. And it has this Orwellian name. They call it religious freedom in hiring rights, which means the freedom not to hire people of the wrong religion. Again, and these changes are subtle. I live in the United States. I certainly don't feel as if I live in a theocracy. My day-to-day life is not particularly different because of this movement. But there are these subtle incremental changes that eventually add up to quite a profound shift, and are especially profound. On the wrong end of this, and realizes that things have become possible in the United States that didn't used to be possible. The other thing, well, actually, I'll leave it there for now.
Okay, thanks. Did you want to respond?
Yeah. Well, if you are going to state that this kind of policy belongs to the Christian nationalist policy, then I'm also a Christian nationalist. I worked for a long time, for example, within a Dutch Confederation of Christian Trade Unions. And from my point of view, it is quite acceptable at that moment that if you are going to hire new people, that you are demanding, do you believe in the objectives and in the principles of the Dutch Christian Trade Union movement? And also at the moment that you are receiving money from the government to do some projects, for example, in other countries, you still have to support the objectives and also some kind of religious background of this organization. I'm a member of the Christian Democratic Party, and if I'm going to be a member of the Christian Democratic Party, they are going to ask me, do you support the principles of the Christian Democratic Party, which are more or less based also on Christian belief. So for that reason, I don't see the problem in that respect. The second one, you are describing that some of those organizations have, at the moment that you would like to have a treatment, for example, drugs addictment, then they are proposing some kind of, I don't know the word, to get you to more Christian belief. But due to the fact that there is the voucher system, people can choose themselves. They can also go to other organizations. It is their choice whether they would like to go to that organization which has that kind of treatment or go to another. So, and my final remark, aren't you, my impression is at some times that you are putting forward your cosmopolitan point of view against the Christian nationalist point of view. And
yes, to that I confess. I have a cosmopolitan point of view. I cherish my rootless cosmopolitanism. And I would say that this kind of cosmopolitanism has been under attack in the United States and I think needs to be defended. You frequently will hear in the United States, New York City where I live, denigrated and spoken of with absolute contempt that would never be, in a way that would never be acceptable to talk about, say, Texas. I actually do believe that cosmopolitan values are necessary to defend, that societies that adopt them are substantially saner and more just and more livable places, and that is borne out actually by the kind of figures.
I do agree on that. I would like to do the same, defend those beautiful cosmopolitan values. I never earned a hand clap that easy.
And also,
but I want to say something else.
Let me first give a point of order. If you want to finish that thought, and then we'll get.
No, I actually remembered what I'd wanted to say, and I was just hoping. You were saying, how many people really believe that the world is 6,000 years old? I suspect that you will agree that this is not, in fact, a fringe position in the United States. That it's far more common than people in Europe would believe.
I think it is I think in terms of creationism, I think it is a book from, I think Americans who subscribe to creationism is something over 60%, isn't it? I think of the total number of Americans surveyed, and we're talking about all Americans then, so the number is relatively high. Senator, you wanted to say something about...
I would like to defend the same cosmopolitan values, but I do think then there is still a job to do. And that means that the 60% Kennedy is referring to other issues which we find very, very strange, like negative emotions about gay people, etc. The question is, what we are seeing now in America, and probably also in Holland, might be not a Christian conservative movement, but might be a kind of firm uncertainty within society. Because of secularization, because of the very main political issue of the individual freedom during the last 20, 30 years, it might be a response to that. Nothing to do with religion, really nothing to do with religion, everything to do with fear, people for living together with other people who are different.
So this is a kind of, so what you're saying here is actually, and this is also an extension of what you said earlier, that there is, in this sense, an important parallel between the Netherlands and the United States, that with the increasing secularization and individualization, you get anxiety and fear that, in fact, translates itself in various ways, but that's something that you see in both places.
That's what you might see in both places. I don't think it's organized. I don't think there is something... I do think it's unconscious, not a conscious but an unconscious movement, which finds its organizations. But I do not really think that these organizations are of any importance and lasting longer than 10 or 15 years.
You say something about this in your book also, about the role of anxiety in the last 30 or 40 years. Do you find this a plausible theory?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. I mean, part of what's happened is that there is substantial upheaval, there is substantial insecurity in American life, and there is substantial social breakdown in the United States. And what this movement that I'm talking about has done is created an all-encompassing ideology that explains it all, that has a kind of powerful scapegoat in these homosexual activists who've attacked the family, and that by kind of getting rid of them, by triumphing, by reasserting our values, we can reassert some kind of social stability and return to some lost golden age. So I think that, yeah, the underlying things are substantially economic, they're substantially existential, they're about modernism, and there's certainly also the case that we have two corresponding trends in the United States. The two quickest growing blocks of people in surveys are people who claim no religion and people who are evangelical, and the two things I think feed off each other. There's a growing trend of kind of militant atheism and hostility towards religion, and represented by the success of books like Richard Dawkins and Tim Harris. Which then kind of fuels this idea that Christianity is under attack, that we're at war. The final thing I would say is that I don't think people are necessarily wrong in the United States when they sense that their families and their social bonds are being eroded. I think they have the wrong idea of where this is from, but it's certainly clear that, especially in the states where this movement is strongest, divorce rates are very, very high. Teenage pregnancy rates are very high. Abortion rates are quite high. Kind of every measure of social breakdown is highest in the places where this conservative movement has become most entrenched. And the reason for that, I think, is pretty clear. It's because this movement, unlike I think in Holland, comes along with a very kind of brutally libertarian economic philosophy. So places where they've instituted, incredibly low taxes, where they've stopped funding public schools, where they fund very few social services, creates all this breakdown. People are looking for a way to understand this breakdown. They're looking for a way to understand their kind of diminishing economic circumstances, the fact that people are working harder and harder, they spend very little time together, they spend very, very little time with their children. So they understand there's something wrong with their family life, and then they're being told it's because your family are under attack by secularists and homosexuals, and it's very powerful.
Yeah, there is I think a sign in Seattle, a public service announcement where parents are urged to have at least one meal a week with their children. in the United States. I think it hasn't quite come as far as that in the Netherlands in most situations, but it's a sign of the processes obviously evident in American society that maybe leads to some of these anxieties. Mr. Hagoort?
You just said that there is no conspiracy. You also said Christian right does not use illegal means. You even said that essentially their analysis of what's going wrong in America is all right. So I think what is at stake is that your worldview, your answer to these problems is the one growing movement, and then we have the other growing movement. And in your book, you make a polarization. There's a lot of, for a Dutchman, I do not agree with a lot of Christian in America ideology, but your metaphors are metaphors of war and struggle. I mean, there's a lot of battle in your book.
I'm curious about, because those are usually quotes from the other side. I mean,
No,
I do talk about it in that, but that's the kind of dominant political paradigm in the United States.
I just underlined the sentences in the book where you make comparisons, mostly in phrases like, I do not want to say that they are a kind of Taliban, but, or they are no fascists, but. They do not want to extinct the Jews, but...
Well, I certainly don't say that they are...
So that's my English.
Okay.
You are suggesting they do not hate Jews, but the mechanisms they use do represent the same. And then you quote 1937 sources. So I think that does not contribute to a solution for a problem that you rightly discover in America or in Europe between the struggle between different worldviews. And it's neither the solution is to a polarization, nor claiming some kind of superiority by saying I'm not religious or neutral. Politics is not about neutrality. It's not about the objective truth. It's about ideologies.
Would you like to respond to that briefly? And I have a question for you in respect to that, because I was wondering about the AO in this respect. But if you want to say something briefly, then I can.
Well, sure. I would say first of all, the idea that we are the kind of language of war, and I think that's an interesting response. Probably something I haven't even thought about because it's so ingrained in the American political dialogue. It is so pervasive in the kind of movement that I'm talking about. And if I use it, that's a kind of interesting observation. What I would say is a couple of things. I don't agree with their analysis. I agree that the problem, it's like saying that, again, and at the risk of making another Holocaust analogy, but I would, for example, to say that you agree in the 1930s that there is a kind of breakdown in German society and that things are out of control and that the economy is being looted, to say that you agree with that analysis is not to say that you agree with anti-Semitism. And I would say similar things, that yes, they are talking about kind of deep problems in the United States. I don't agree with I agree that they've identified problems that people are really suffering from. That's very different than saying that I basically agree with their analysis. Finally, I would say that first of all, politics, at least in the United States, has not in the past, there's obviously an ideological component, but it is not always, there is such a thing, and here I'll sound really old-fashioned, there is such a thing as truth, and there has been a way in which in the past in the United States, especially in the civil service, truth and empirical evidence and rationality have been operative principles. They have not been, what you're describing is very interesting because conservative Christians often attack relativism. Often attack the kind of idea that there is no truth. But what you're talking about, there is no truth, there's only ideology, is a radically relativistic position. And it has resulted in the kind of deforming of our social service because although truth is not always apparent to all of us, not everything is a matter of ideology. It's not a matter of ideology whether the world is 6,000 years old or hundreds of millions of years old. It's not a matter of ideology whether gay people are simply suffering from spiritual defects that can be cured, or whether homosexuality is inborn and these treatments have been shown to create psychological devastation. And so when you have kind of a society, it was not a matter of ideology in the time of Mao whether the rice harvest was really the best ever or whether the people were starving. And when the government insists something that is kind of patently not true, something very dangerous, I think, is happening in politics. And that's what I believe has happened in the United States, although not to that extent. And I'll let you go and then I'll come back.
Did you want to respond to this, otherwise I wanted to ask a question about the battle metaphor and the struggle. And
I would like to point out a little. Maybe part of my problem is that the Christian politicians. Politicians. Thank you very much. In Holland, they are and have been in the past quite precise in defending our constitution and the democratic system. And they have been very precise in making a distinction between their personal political views and values and the values of the democratic system as such. And that distinction is very important because at the moment that you are that's why I did not agree with what you were saying. The moment these two are getting together, then we are in danger. Because then religion and constitution will be one. And that's something I have never heard a Christian in Holland stated that, at least in the Senate. That's okay. That's one thing. And the other thing I wanted to say is, we're talking now about truth, absolute truth, scientific truth. And of course it's very silly to deny things which are obvious from a scientific point of view. There's one little problem about politics, and that it's not very logical way of making money, in my case, because it's one of these things which is not about truth. It's essential that it's not about truth. Politics as such is about believing in what will be the best concerning the future, and not what is known given the past. And this difference is very important, because I do not believe in God. I'm not a member of a church. I'm a Catholic, but I was born that way. It's not something to get rid of. I tried, but it didn't work. But I do believe in some ways of organizing the society, and these are believings.
Well, what I would say is that certainly you have beliefs about and values and ideas about the way things should be. What I'm talking about is the undermining of fact as such. It's one thing to say, I believe that some people believe that the United States should spread democracy by force. Some people don't. That's not that's about belief and about faith and about ideology. Whether or not Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction is a question of fact, and that's where I'm talking, where the kind of undermining that I think is dangerous has been.
Okay.
So shifting over, just wondering about, since you brought that up, about the sort of stridency of the book, and also the stridency of conservative Christians in the United States. I was wondering to what extent that's true in the Evangelical Broadcasting Association.
And by stridency you mean?
Well, meaning that you have a sense that you are battling for the soul of a nation. That the Netherlands was once a Christian nation that is now being lost, and we must do something to restore it. Is that something that has been part of the history of the Evangelical Broadcasting Association, of the small, more conservative Christian parties? And how does that relate to the present day?
I think most of the Orthodox Christians in Holland are just recovering from the experience. They are no longer a majority in Holland, and it just they are not struggling for not for nationalism. That's a word I do not recognize for as if Holland is a Christian nation or so whatever. But
God Nederland Oranje.
It's not. I don't see it in my surroundings, and I see a lot of people also in politics. So there are contacts between politics, Christians, churches, organizations. You named the Salvation Army. I'm in the board of the Salvation Army in the Netherlands. They have about 190 million euros state finance every day, but they are invited by the government of Amsterdam to look after the poor and the homeless. So I think there are a lot of contacts and public money in Christian organizations, but there's not an ideology of political power.
How do they do the hiring thing in the Netherlands? Is that does that look like what Michelle Goldberg describes in her book? What are the faith requirements for hiring people with salvation?
They adhere to Christian faith.
Okay, so
As is the Evangelical Broadcasting Company, and when you go to the Buddhist Broadcasting Company, you have to be a Buddhist.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the wonderful things of the Dutch system and of the Dutch freedoms, but I cannot see discrimination in it.
how about, is there any sympathy at all when you think about also in Christian democratic circles more widely or in the evangelical circles with the political program of the religious right in the United States? Does it exist? And maybe tying it in more...
There is a growing influence, and that's something that's very strange to the Dutch Christian culture, but there is a growing influence of American booklets and literature and leaflets and activism, Christian activism. And I see a kind of a growing simplicity among evangelicals, because the tradition that's stemming from the Reformation, it's quite a theological, a philosophical tradition with debate, and there is a debate about evolution and creationists.
You mean actually not simplicity, but simplistic and growing
simplistic, yes, simple,
okay.
going simple, yes. So that's so activism and stopping the debate and just believing what you're reading, the Bible as a holy book instead of a study book with God's word in it. So there are influences from America that are growing, because I think until a few decades ago, most influences on Dutch Christianity came from Germany and from German theologians. And I'm a bit concerned about this influence, because it's another culture, Christian
culture.
culture.
Actually, I mean, if I may ask a question.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
How that influence plays itself out? Like, what are the issues and what are the practical results of that influence?
Does it have anything other than a theological effect, the American influences? Is it just
No,
about
it's leading
theological
to,
mindlessness, or
for
is there something
example,
else?
you are describing the mega churches in America. I see growing mega churches in Holland, planting of mega churches in Holland, and they are extracting people from the local churches. And there is a different kind of theology, more activism in these churches, as if Christianity is something that can be organized instead of a thing of the soul. So there is American influence, and it's not good for Dutch Christianity in all its aspects. So I agree on that, also in your book.
And when you say activism, does that mean also a political kind of activism? Is this translating into political activism?
Very focused on opwekking and
revival.
A kind of revival. So not in the classical Dutch way of participating in the public domain, in schools, in care, in social welfare, but more preaching and directed directly to the soul, more than to the head.
But there is an increasing moralism in Dutch politics. And I don't.
No, but I'm just
Let me finish. I do not know if we have to be negative about it. It might be a correction of the past 20, 30 years, where there was a too liberal, but then in the Dutch meaning of the word, maybe kind of politics. I do not know if these things are connected to each other. I do not know if the source of this moralism is a Christian one. I do find it in my own party also.
So this goes back to your earlier point about the moralism being something broader or bigger than religion. Is there a
maybe dangerous, more dangerous because
and
it's more powerful. Than
more dangerous because it's more powerful?
Yeah.
When, at least for the Christian Democrats, but also what I've seen in my investigations, there is not a kind of process like Christian nationalism as it is in the United States. For example, Christian Democratic Party is one of the most pro-European political parties here in the Netherlands, also with Labour Party together with the Progressive Liberals, but we are one of the most pro-European political parties. So there is not a kind of Christian nationalism in that aspect. The question is, why is there a kind of revival of those moralism or Christian organizations?
Is there a revival of Christian organizations?
Just let me...
Okay, sorry.
And what I see, at least from some investigation what I've done, why are there in some countries some Christian organizations? And there are a lot of influences, but one of the main aspects is that there has been a lot of hostility to the Christian faith and to people who thought that Christian belief might also play an important role for their daily life, might play an important role for what they were doing in politics or for perhaps within trade unions or whatsoever. And in those countries where there is not a very hostile attitude, for example in Scandinavia, there are no Christian organizations due to the fact that nobody had the impression that they had to defend their own Christian belief and to have their own Christian aspect. So perhaps there might be a kind, and I agree in that respect with Noten, a kind of correction or the feeling that there should be a kind of correction to a libertarian attitude or atmosphere in society, for example, in the 80s and the 90s. And that might be one of the reasons why there is a kind of revival of also some moralism in the Netherlands. For example, there was a kind of feeling of tolerance, and at a certain moment that tolerance went too far, so that it was not only tolerant what you are doing is right, but it was more you can do it as long as I don't have any negative consequences of it. So there was not a concern with each other in society, not a community feeling. And that might be one of the sources of more Christian organizations, also in the Netherlands in some respect, and also a need for a revival of moralism.
What do you mean by moralism in the political context of
Noten?
the Netherlands?
Children shouldn't drink alcohol before they are 18. It's my son's favorite. Who is just 16, so he thought now it's happening. And that's these kind of things. No naked women on television. It's small, but it's something. It says something about boundaries, which people think have vanished. It's also in the political system. Not government, not the government which rules the country in its own, but also not all power to shareholders, for example. A very actual discussion at the moment. It's discussion about the Rhineland model, which is important. That it's underlying it. I don't think it's a real way back. You know, it's what people want these days. Politics is also about what people want. I hope.
Yeah.
There are all kinds of questions we could raise also in respect to how Islam is fueling these kinds of issues, and to what extent that plays a role in the United States, to what extent immigration plays a role in the United States, or in the Netherlands and Europe. Because of the time, though, I want to actually throw this open to all the people who are here tonight, and ask if there are a couple of microphones here, if they have a question for any or all of the people sitting to my right or to my left. Sir, if you'd like to go up to a microphone so everybody can hear, first up here in the front and then there in the back.
Hi, my name is Killiam. I have a question, I think, for Michelle, but Mr. Hagoort mentioned the word which triggered this, Taliban. Do you think there's a global symmetry between what's happening in the Western Christianity and what's happening in Eastern Muslim world? I'm sorry, I haven't read your book, so
Right.
maybe you covered
No,
that.
I would say, there's an obvious difference in terms of, the movement that I'm describing in the United States has been overwhelmingly nonviolent, although not completely. I mean, most terrorism in the United States is by conservative Christians against abortion clinics and the like. But no, for the most part, it's substantially, the threat it poses is, I think, the kind of immediate physical threat that it poses is far, far less than that posed by
the jihad. Where I do see similarities is in the idea that, there was a kind of foundational thinker of Al-Qaeda ideology named Dijk, who wrote a series of books that sought to kind of find in the Quran a detailed guide to every single detail of daily life. And the movement that I'm describing has often tried to do something similar, so that the idea of the biblical worldview in its kind of American incarnation is that you can find in the Bible very precise and detailed guides to govern every single aspect of kind of public and private life and policy and the like, and that if you kind of have the right worldview, in certain ways it's almost like the Communist Party. If you have the correct kind of the correct understanding of the dialectic and the correct party line, everything suddenly falls into place. So, for example, there are books that purport to show that the Bible mandates a flat tax of 10% in the United States. There are kind of books that purport to find in the Bible these very precise directions, that basically leave very little room for deliberation or difference of opinions. I see that orientation towards the world as being a similar phenomenon, and I think people seek a similar kind of solace in that all-encompassing structure. But again, I don't believe that, except for a handful of people who could fit in this room, I don't think that the Christian right wants to create a Christian version of the Taliban. And I think that that's kind of a red herring. The real danger, as I see it, is not a Christian Taliban, but a country where the kind of equality that I've grown up taking for granted is replaced by a situation in which people can practice their religion as they see fit, but they'll be expected to know their place. And America's identity will go from being secular to being kind of substantially Christian, and all kinds of civil rights that have been hard won over the last 30 years will be reversed.
Henk?
Yeah, there are some statements in your book, as I mentioned earlier, that, for example, America is not yet close to becoming a theocracy, but it is in danger of turning into a place where only conservative Christians really belong. Most American evangelicals don't want to establish a Christian Taliban, but their version of tolerance is often very different, etc. But you explained that, yes. But I think there's also a kind of an experience with holy texts. I mean, holy texts are to be interpreted every time. There are ages, centuries of wisdom in interpreting texts in the Jewish tradition, in the Muslim tradition, in the Christian tradition. And people within these traditions often hear other things than people who are not in this tradition. In my church, I sing, they are translated from America, but I sing songs like Land is Conquered. I mean, by praying, and we tear walls down. But there's no Christian Holland who translates that in political terms. It's religious talk. And I mean, a religious language, you cannot interpret religious language in political programs.
We want to make sure there's enough room for the audience. If you want to just say a couple things.
The only thing I would say is that in the United States there has been a real conflation. So one thing I quote is a preacher in a church talking about the election and saying, "We're going to form a mighty army and march on the voting booth." He might be using religious language, but this is clearly for political purposes.
Just for an example, in our company, and we are not in the Dutch tradition, we have 500,000 Christian members, and we can discuss about evolution and about there's no point about it. But when we have worship in our company, we sing "Make us an army, O Lord." It's a song, but it's a spiritual language that has its roots in biblical tradition.
Okay.
Not in politics.
We had somebody there in the back. You were first, and then you can do it, and then we have another one on cue there. So
I just have a question about: is there a medium, some kind of development of theology in America, where actually this kind of anti-theology is being deconstructed somehow? I mean, is there a theology in the United States at the moment which is actually fighting a Christian theology, which is actually trying to have a debate or a communication or dialogue with these?
Yes. Why don't you go ahead and take that?
Yeah, there absolutely is, and it's coming from a couple of different directions. I mean, again, although I'm not a Christian, most of the debate within the United States, because America is so overwhelmingly composed of confessed Christians, necessarily a lot of this happens within Christianity. And there's been two different reactions to this movement. First, part of it is evangelical. There's been, a kind of rising up, although there's still a minority of left evangelicals who see in the Bible a kind of a social gospel message. One thing that's very different about the American religious right, maybe as opposed to the kind of moralism in Holland, is that it's intensely pro-business, it's intensely anti-regulation, anti-welfare, all of these kind of things. And so you've seen maybe a left, some of these left evangelicals who maybe have a kind of more European style understanding of, kind of Christian social welfare. That's part of it. You also have seen a lot of organizations among the old school mainline churches, the Episcopalians, the Methodists, United Church of Christ, Lutherans, and I've actually I've been invited to speak at many churches and seminaries, which is not what I was expecting at all when I wrote the book, by people who feel that their kind of Christianity is under attack by a movement that claims to be the kind of sole interpreters of the gospel, and that is also really attacking a lot of, again, I understand I'm using this language, but that is how it's understood, this kind of attack, where, for example, you're seeing in the United States right now an attempt to strip the Anglican Church of its role within, to strip the Episcopalian Church of its role within the Anglican Communion because of its tolerance towards gay people. People who are part of that tradition feel incredibly besieged and are trying to organize some kind of a response.
Okay. Yeah, the emphasis on business and on a rugged individualism is, I think, also expressed by the erroneous belief of a majority of Americans that it is a biblical text, the expression, God helps those who help themselves. That's apparently to be found in the Bible. That's not the case, I guess. We had a question back there.
The gentleman from the CDR and from the Evangelical Broadcasting Group were mentioning that some of the things in Michelle's book were not necessarily applicable to the Netherlands of today. So what is your view on the fact that a party like SGP in the Netherlands, which advocates the elimination of female suffrage and the blatant condemnation of gay unions, has so many seats in parliament, if this race of Christian values is not also applicable to the Netherlands? And tied to this, what do you think is the reason for certain Christian groups that there is this need to proselytize and to impose these values onto the rest of society who may not necessarily want to live by them? What makes these values so worthy that people should be imposed them? I mean, people should have to abide by them, whether they want to or not, because when these values become law, then we cannot choose whether we like to live under them or not. We have to. So what is about these values that is so important and worthy that me, a non-believer, would have to live under them?
Perhaps I may start with the question about the SGP. I'm not somebody who has to defend the SGP. It's up to them to defend themselves. And you know that there has been a discussion and also a rule of, or at least a verdict of the court about their point of view. So for that reason, it is a process which is over there. But more about your second question. What I've tried to explain in my last moments that I took the floor was that there was, in some aspects, some hostility also to some Christian aspects. For example, about euthanasia and the way it has been discussed also in Dutch Parliament has touched a lot of Christian believers in the way it has been discussed. The way that, for example, some people have thought about, for example, the Sunday's rest and the way that it should we should do something about it, it has touched some people. That is not the reason why some political parties would like to have more emphasis on those values. It is more about the kind of, and we had already a discussion about it and we agreed more or less about it, that there was a kind of need, more need in a soft way or a tough way, but I think that it should be more in a soft way, a kind of moralism, in the way that more emphasis should be put on community aspects. And that aspect is one of the aspects which you see, for example, now in some Christian political parties. And we are not imposing all those aspects on you, but the only aspect might be, why are some aspects imposed on the Christian believers on what you think? So that's always, there should be a kind of respect vis-à-vis each other. And sometimes there has been some disbalance, and perhaps there is some reaction to it.
I'll note, and very briefly, I want to also make sure we have a room for a couple more questions.
To talk about truth, what politics and truth, sometimes they go together. There's a myth in Holland that all social democratic ministers of finance always make a mess of it, which is historical, not true. And
show me one example.
And there is also a myth that Christian democratic politicians do not work on moral law, new moral law. And also this is not true. The euthanasia law was made by, here's Berlin, Christian Democratic. The law about the gay marriage in Holland was supported by almost all Christian Democrats in Parliament. And I can make 4, 5, 6 very firm examples of that. The fact is that we almost always needed Christian Democrats in government to make these real breakthroughs.
Question back.
I do not, ik bedoel, wat waar is waar. Hè? Ik zeg het niet graag, maar het is wel zo.
Mrs. Goldberg, my name is Abraham Grandia. I'm working at Econ, Ecumenical Broadcasting Company. I'm working as a referent. I'm very glad with your book. 30 years ago, I read a book called Twilight of the Saints, Biblical Christianity and Civil Religion in America. It's from 2 evangelical professors in history, and they are warning for a form of Christophicism within the evangelical movement. This was 30 years ago. I think your book is very lucid about this dangerous development. And I don't understand why Mr. Hagoort, because my question is to you, why you are talking about conspiracy when, at the moment, when Mrs. Goldberg is describing a strategy. Why do you call a strategy a conspiracy? That's the best way to attack Mrs. Goldberg, but she don't speak about conspiracy, she is speaking about what's happening now in the United States. And I don't agree with you that there's not much sympathy in the Netherlands. The movement Christians for Israel, now liated with Evangelical Broadcasting Company, are talking also pro-Israel, against gay parade in Jerusalem, against Palestinians, against euthanasia, against abortion. So that's the movement Christians for Israel from Mr. Glashouder. I think within the members of your broadcasting company have a lot of sympathy for what's going on, also in the United States.
Maybe we can, given those examples, isn't there in fact a political agenda of the kind outlined by the questioner in respect to the constituency of the Evangelical Broadcasting Association, or is that overdrawn?
There are a lot of political issues at stake, and also issues where there are strong opinions among Christians, and I think that's very good for democracy, and I see no problem. As you said, it's not illegal. The tone, the sphere in the book is when you discover in the book links or personal relationships or people who meet each other, that doesn't mean they are having the same political agenda and are combining their actions for one political goal. And if you exaggerate that aspect, then conspiracy is very near. That's what I'm saying. And of course there are among Christians in our background, there are strong opinions about Israel, but there are strong discussions as well within the group. There is debate within, between the 500,000 members. I don't know if there's a lot of debate among the group you describe in America, but there is debate. There is no Christian right in the Netherlands, there's a Christian left. Most of the people in our, in EO are voting for the Christian Union, as it's called in Dutch politics, and they do not adhere to a form of theocracy like the SGP.
About the United States, because there are very essential differences between the several states. That's my first remark. The second is that there is also an easy talk about the Bible, but the leader of the Christianity was Jesus Christ, and therefore he has always said you have to be nice to other people and not fight them for religious reasons. And nevertheless, that is a forgotten lesson by Christians, but in the Islam it's just the contrary, because the leader of the Islam said, well, when other people don't believe your religion, you have to cut his throat. What are you thinking about this essential structural situation worldwide when we have a political view about things?
Is that me? Well, again, the reason I use Christian nationalism is to separate this political movement to not conflate it with Christianity. And I certainly don't want to conflate the Republican Party in the United States with, one of the great faiths of the world, or to conflate, as too many people have done in the United States, the person of George Bush with the person of Jesus Christ. In terms of Christianity and Islam, there are in both books, there are in both books a lot of very bloody and violent commandments. In Christianity, I would say it comes also, one of the interesting things about this movement is that they often seem to be more enamored with the Old Testament than with the New. And so you'll find kind of endless references to Leviticus and endless references to, these kind of really, to the kind of, intolerant, punishing God of the Old Testament, and then to the book of Revelation. I often feel like the only two books that they are particularly interested in, again, are Leviticus and Revelation, with maybe some numbers thrown in also. You can find in Islam, obviously, horrific exhortations to kill believers. You can also find in the Quran, which I'm by no means an expert on, exhortations to protect civilians, protect non-combatants, to, fight only in self-defense. I think that it's not so much in the essence of either book, but in the parts that are emphasized to form the basis of ideology. I mean, there have been many there have been times when Islamic civilizations have been the kind of beacons of humanism in the world, while Christianity was, waging kind of bloody war against unbelievers. We're not in such a time now, but I don't know if that has as much to do with the books themselves as with the people who are interpreting them.
Thank you. Over there, and then you, ma'am, and then I think maybe we'll see how much time we've got then. I think we'll have to leave it at two. Two more questions.
I have more of a comment than a question. Firstly, or specifically about the conspiracy theory, as you said. I strongly disagree with that, firstly, because she's not the first person to speak of this or this parallel reality, or the first person I read of that is reported on this. Secondly, I grew up in a country where it was not a conspiracy theory, it was not an alternate reality, it was not even a possibility, it was a fact and a reality, which is South Africa of the 1980s. So I would like to, well, the result of which is debatable. The right-wing Christians at this stage believe that, you know, everything that they advocated in the past, everything they warned us would happen has now happened. I don't know if you know that South Africa suffers approximately 20,000 murders a year. Or the alternate to that is still having apartheid. So I would like to hear your comments on that, because the apartheid, the national party in South Africa, was undeniably a Dutch Reformed Christian nationalist institution.
You're addressing it to Henk Hagoort in particular, or Jan Jacob van Dijk? Jan Jacob?
Yeah, but I don't like your comparison. And you might not be disturbed by the fact that I don't like it, due to the fact that you are putting me something in my shoes, to put it, to paraphrase a Dutch proverb, that what the national party in South Africa has done, based on their ideology, based perhaps on their belief, that should also be, or that might also be something really based on Christian belief. Perhaps it might be, from their point of view, but I'm not going to defend it. And better to say, if I'm going to see what the Dutch Christian organizations have done to finish apartheid, also in South Africa, I can put other examples also on the other side. So for that reason, I think that your comparison is not a relevant comparison in this respect. Yeah, but that's all right. Okay. That's true. But that is also for other ideologies which are going too far and too perverse. It is not only within the Christian situation, it is also within other ideologies that you see it. So for that reason, if that's the remark you would like to make, I agree with you.
Okay. One last question. Yes, please.
I want to thank you and other people like you who have started to make me feel that maybe there is some sanity in my country. I've been living in Ireland now for 35 years, and I have been following the last two elections, which of course are also debatable. The honesty and the fact of our leader, our great leader, I won't compare him to Jesus, really was elected or not. But I would also like to get back to the conspiracy comment that was made. Call it a conspiracy, call it a strategy, call it whatever you want. But the fact is that in the latest of the very, very many, almost innumerable scandals that have been taking place in our country within this government regime, whatever you want to call it, these last years, the Justice Department scandal, it turns out there have been hundreds of people working for the Justice Department whose only qualification is that they've been graduates from, what is that?
Regent University.
Yeah,
Pat Robertson's, yes.
What they call it, a tier 3 university, which means like the lowest of the lowest, like it's like getting your college diploma from the HEMA. But anyway, Gonzalez's deputy, his assistant, Monica Goodling, a 30-year-old woman. I mean, there are fortunately some 30-year-old women who do have some brains. This one did not. And she had a lot of power, and she was choosing justices on the merits of their political persuasion. And maybe you can tell to people a little bit more about this. I think it's very, very important to understand the fact that somebody might think there's a conspiracy or a strategy, whatever.
Do you want to say something more very briefly, cogently to that particular development?
Sure. I mean, there's been a number of scandals where there's been a purge in the United States of U.S. attorneys who were not sufficiently loyal to the ruling regime, as it were. And what's come out is that one of the women who engineered this is a graduate of Pat Robertson's Regent University. And there's been, I think, there's 150 other graduates of Regent University in the administration. And the reason this is significant is because Regent University is not just a conservative version of, say, other liberal universities. It's like an incredibly radical they indoctrinate people in some of the kind of most radically anti-democratic aspects of the ideology that I've tried to enumerate here. And again, it's not a conspiracy, but it is a way of kind of when you take people whose only qualifications is their, kind of ideological consistency and seed them throughout the government, you do necessarily see a change in the way the government works. And what's happened at the Justice Department is one result of that.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I suggest give all of our panelists a hand before Corrine Klaesmans closes it up.
Well, I'm happy that the influence in the Netherlands is the influence of moralism and not of Christian evangelism on politics. Thank you for your remark, Mr. Noten, Mr. Van Dijk, Mr. Hagoort. Thank you very much for your speech, Michelle, and you stood your man between this male-dominated panel. Thank you very much. And thank you, James Kennedy, for moderating this event. Thank you very much. For now, I would like to thank also Ten Have publishers. I also would like to thank my staff and our volunteers who helped out tonight. Mrs. Goldberg will sign her book here on stage, and you can buy a copy in the back of this room. And if you would like to have more information about the John Adams Institute, becoming a member or becoming a volunteer, please contact me directly. And I hope to welcome you at our next event in The Hague with Niall Ferguson. That's on the 22nd of May. It's a Tuesday. Thank you for coming.